Hello, I'm Ron Strickland. This webcast is one of a series in which I'm presenting some brief lectures and commentaries on topics from the courses I teach in literature and cultural studies. Here I want to say some things about Jean Rhys's novel, Wide Sargasso Sea, published in 1966. Wide Sargasso Sea was written as a prequel to Charlotte Bronte's novel, Jane Eyre. Drawing on slight details in Bronte's novel, Rhys creates a backstory for the marriage between Edward Rochester, the younger son of a wealthy English aristocrat who nonetheless has no money of his own, and Bertha Antoinette Mason, a wealthy Jamaican heiress. It is possible to read Wide Sargasso Sea on its own terms, with no prior knowledge of Jane Eyre. But Jean Rhys seems to assume that most readers will have at least a vague awareness of Charlotte Bronte's novel. The critic Michael Thorpe puts it this way: "It would be foolish to deny that many average readers come to Wide Sargasso Sea with some recollection of Jane Eyre, and that Rhys relied in a general way on their doing so. Still, she did not assume that her readers' remembrance would be anything but dim and perhaps composed of stereotypes. Rochester recalled as a passionate, Byronically moody man, his life blighted by the secret existence of the mad wife in the attic, she being little more than a figment of the Gothic imagination." So the novel is an experimental novel, especially in the way that it deploys the strategy of intertextuality, straightforwardly inviting readers to bring their knowledge and awareness of characters and situations from Jane Eyre to their interpretations of Wide Sargasso Sea. And the novel is also a notable post-colonial novel. It presents a sharply critical view of English colonialism from the perspective of a marginalized colonial subject, whereas Bronte's Jane Eyre is narrated mostly from the perspective of Jane. Wide Sargasso Sea is narrated through separate voices. The first voice is that of Antoinette, the young Creole girl, who tells the story of her childhood up to the point of her arranged marriage with the Englishman, whom readers will recognize as Jane Eyre's Mr. Rochester. The second section, describing their honeymoon and the rapid deterioration of their marriage, is narrated by the husband. The third section is set in England, at Rochester's Thornfield estate. It begins with some observations by Grace Poole, the servant whom Rochester has hired to guard his wife. Then the rest of Part 3, to the end of the novel, is narrated by the mysterious inmate of Thornfield Hall, the mad wife, now called Bertha rather than Antoinette. In Rhys's novel, it's not absolutely clear what has driven Antoinette to insanity. There's the suggestion of insanity running in her family. There's the description of her unhappy, fearful, insecure childhood. And as we see from Part 2 of the novel, she's been mistreated, disrespected, unloved by her new husband. All of those things together, no doubt, contributed to her condition. Among other things, by splitting the first-person narrative into separate voices, Jean Rhys offers a complicated perspective on the English social status hierarchy of the early 19th century. The lifestyles of wealthy English families depended on various kinds of exploitation: the extraction of wealth from the West Indies and other colonized regions, the system of primogeniture and entailment that concentrated wealth in the hands of elder sons from generation to generation, and the laws that gave husbands complete control of their wives' property upon marriage. All of these conditions are represented in the marriage of Edward Rochester and Bertha Antoinette Mason. So the marriage was a hastily arranged affair, with some dubious motives on both sides. Bertha Antoinette Mason may have been hiding some things about her family background, and Edward Rochester was a fortune hunter. Soon, Rochester's father and his elder brother die. Now he is wealthy, even without his wife's money, but he is stuck with her, and she seems to be showing signs of the insanity that purportedly runs in her family. He returns to England, imprisons his wife in the attic, and eventually proposes marriage to the governess of his charge, his ward, the young Adele. In the first section of the novel, which is narrated by the young Antoinette, we learn that her mother was from Martinique, a French colony, and her mother was much younger than her father. Her father has died, their plantation has declined with the abolition of slavery, and now, in effect, they are poor, so disrespected by the other white Creoles on the island, and also held in contempt by the black inhabitants, some of whom their former slaves. Eventually, however, Antoinette's mother, Annette, the widow of Alexander Causeway, remarries to a wealthy Englishman named Mason. Her mother dies, then her stepfather dies, leaving her a teenager with a fortune. Her older stepbrother, Richard Mason, steps in to arrange her future for her. He's the one who negotiates on her behalf and without her knowledge or prior consent. The stepbrother may think he's doing her a favor, rescuing her from a potential colonial spinsterhood, but in fact, according to English law, her fortune now belongs to her new husband. She is trapped in the marriage without the resources to live independently on her own. In the second part of the novel, which is narrated by Antoinette's husband, the newlywed couple travel to a remote estate that had been owned by Antoinette's mother, called Grandbois. At first, Edward is charmed by his beautiful new bride, but he feels out of place away from the city, such as it is, Spanish town, and away from the community of other white settlers. He receives a letter from someone called Daniel Causeway, who claims to be a half-brother of Antoinette. In the letter, he tells Edward of the misdeeds of Antoinette's deceased father and of the insanity of Antoinette's mother before she died. Reading this account, Edward grows mistrustful and increasingly distant toward Antoinette. Although he initially enjoyed having sex with his beautiful bride, he now finds himself disgusted by her sensuality. He finds her repulsive. By the beginning of the third part of the novel, Rochester is convinced that his wife is insane. Now he has taken her to England, locked her in an attic room, leaving her guarded by the servant Grace Poole. This short section at the beginning of part 3, in which we see the perspective of Grace Poole, the servant, marks a border, a sort of transition between the distinct individual perspectives of Antoinette and Edward in parts 1 and 2, and the individual perspective of Antoinette, now Bertha, in the rest of part 3 to the end of the novel. Here, though, at the beginning of the third part of the novel, we have this short section from the point of view of Grace Poole, and it's the only part of the novel that is not delivered in first-person narration. Instead, the reader is overhearing a conversation between Grace Poole and another servant, Leah. And Grace Poole is describing to Leah how and why she took this job of caring for and guarding Mr. Rochester's mad wife. Grace begins by repeating something that Mrs. Fairfax has said to her. Grace says, "Mrs. F. came to see me, and she complained about gossip. I don't allow gossip. I told you that when you came. Servants will talk, and you can't stop them," I said, "and I'm not certain that the situation will suit me, madam. First, when I answered your advertisement, you said that the person I had to look after was not a young girl. I asked if she was an old woman, and you said no. Now that I see her, I don't know what to think. She sits shivering, and she is so thin. If she dies on my hands, who will get the blame? Then all the servants were sent away, and she engaged a cook, one maid, and you, Leah. They were sent away, but how could she stop them talking? If you ask me, the whole county knows. The rumors I've heard, very far from the truth. But I don't contradict. I know better than to say a word. After all, the house is big and safe, a shelter from the world outside, which, say what you like, can be a black and cruel world to a woman. This working class English woman's perspective from Grace Poole is something different from the attitudes we have seen from the black Jamaicans, and it's also unlike anything that we see in Jane Eyre, where, of course, Grace Poole is a flat character, a kind of a cipher. All we know is that she drinks too much, she doesn't say much, and she's somewhat incompetent, repeatedly falling asleep, allowing Bertha to steal her keys and to go out walking about the mansion in the night. So the remainder of Part 3 is narrated in the first person from Bertha now, the mad wife, and it follows fairly closely a sequence of events that readers of Jane Eyre will be familiar with from Jane's experiences at Thornfield, including Bertha's nighttime excursions and presumably the noises that she makes that Jane hears. This all culminates in a dream that Bertha has about a fire. When she wakes from the dream, she picks up the candle to walk out of her room. And that's where the novel ends. She doesn't actually start the fire in Wide Sargasso Sea, as she does in Jane Eyre. So we don't know for sure what she's going to do. But it's a pretty safe bet that she's going to start that fire. That's where it ends. I've been focusing mostly on the thematic parallels and connections between Jane Eyre and Wide Sargasso Sea, but I'd also like to point out some formal and generic conventions that the two novels share. First, Wide Sargasso Sea, like Jane Eyre, is a sort of a bildungsroman, except that Wide Sargasso Sea might be seen as a failed bildungsroman or a tragic bildungsroman, one in which the young person doesn't grow up to a happy, secure adulthood. Second, Wide Sargasso Sea, like Jane Eyre, has many elements of the Gothic romance. We have the exotic setting of Jamaica, the descriptions of wild nature, including from the title itself, the Sargasso Sea, as well as the lush vegetation of Jamaica. Another Gothic element in Wide Sargasso Sea is the presence of the supernatural, here most prominently figured in the character Christophine, Annette's servant and Antoinette's guardian. Christophine is a black woman from Martinique, but living in Jamaica, of course, in Annette and Antoinette's household, and she practices obeah. She seems to have supernatural powers. The other black Jamaicans respect and fear her. Antoinette presses Christophine to make a love potion that will cause Edward to fall in love with her. Reluctantly, Christophine makes the potion, and Antoinette gives it to her husband in a glass of wine. But unfortunately, when the potion takes effect, Edward's desire turns toward the servant Amélie rather than toward his wife Antoinette. Finally, I think both novels are important landmarks in the history of writing by women and about women. They are both part of the feminist tradition, and it's not insignificant that Wide Sargasso Sea offers a critique of the vision of female empowerment that we find in Jane Eyre. A lot had changed between the publication of Jane Eyre in 1847 and the publication of wide Sargasso Sea in 1966. On that note, I'll conclude this webcast. But, as always, if you have questions or comments, send me an email.